Before I became a pastor in the United Methodist Church, I studied video production. Now, together with my wife, a trained journalist turned missionary, I make documentaries about social injustice. For the last year, we've been hearing a lot of talk about the rapid growth of our country's prison population. So we decided to look into what's really going on. Our research began with the hot-button topic of mass incarceration, which has been gaining national attention in the media. After reading a small mountain of books and articles on the subject, we reached out to people who could talk about the underlying reasons for the rising U.S. prison population. We went to meet with Ed Ryan, who spent 14 years working inside Ohio's prison system.
From 1925 to 1975, we found a certain stability in our rate of incarceration across the nation. For nearly 50 years, the rate of incarceration didn't fluctuate much above 110 to 120 per 100,000. And in 1975, our prison population stood at 241,000. Now we are talking about, in just a matter of 3 to 4 decades later, we are at 2.2 to 2.3 million. That is an astounding difference, and that rate of incarceration also, it speaks to a rate around 750 per 100,000.
The rise of mass incarceration has happened quickly from a historical perspective. In 1925, the U.S. prison population was proportionate to most other Western countries. But by the 1960s, times were changing. Countercultural forces were growing in popularity. The civil rights movement was underway with a penchant for civil disobedience. Many middle-class white citizens were ready for a return to law and order, and politicians found a new platform for their campaigns.
We went through several decades of time that for political reasons and for other reasons, each party anteed up the dosage. If one party said, we are all for 3 strikes and you're out, the other party said, we're for 2 strikes and you're out. And so in some respects, there was a competition to ensure that each party in its own right was always perceived by the voting population as being tough and aggressive on crime.
Along with the tough on crime approach came an expansion of the use of mandatory minimum sentencing. Once reserved primarily for violent offenses, mandatory minimum sentences require that a person convicted of a certain type of crime spend a certain number of years behind bars. During the rise of mass incarceration, mandatory sentences began to work their way into nonviolent offenses, in particular the possession and distribution of drugs. To learn more about how prison sentencing changed during this period, we talked to Professor Angela Davis.
It was sort of an unholy alliance between Republicans and Democrats, both who thought that they were doing a good thing here. The Republicans on their side, they were saying, well, we don't want judges giving people a break just because they had, a poor childhood or whatever. Everybody needs to be treated the same. And then you had people on the Democratic side that were saying, well, we don't want these judges giving rich people a break. Everybody's got to be treated the same. Some of these sentences are 5, 10, 15, 20 years that you have to do. And many people, myself included, believe that these sentences are just way, way too harsh. And we've heard horror stories about individuals, first-time offenders, individuals being caught with a certain small amount of drugs and going to prison for many, many, many years.
By 2012, 716 out of every 100,000 Americans were incarcerated. This represents a quintupling of our prison population, a multiplying by 5. Today, the U.S. accounts for less than 5% of the world's population, and almost 25% of the world's prisoners. Without contention, our rate of incarceration is higher than any other country in the world, including Iran, Rwanda, and Russia. Russia. The country that invented the Gulag. This is not a place that is known for its soft treatment of criminals. The current director of Ohio's Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections first began working in Ohio's prison system in 1974 and has witnessed the change firsthand.
When I started, we had 8,300 people incarcerated in our prison system. Today, we have 50,500. During my career, a six-fold growth with little change in the population of this state. And as I look, if I were to ask most people, do we feel safer now in 2014 than we did in 1974, I don't believe people would say that.
I pledge allegiance to the flag.
We were surprised to hear how eager our country is to take away people's freedom. From an early age, children are taught that the U.S. was founded on the principles of liberty and justice for all. There have always been setbacks in living up to this ideal, like the embarrassing fact that every single one of our founding fathers owned slaves. But the arc of justice is long, and it's something our country claims to take seriously. The long march toward liberty and justice is built into the landscape of our nation's capital, where you can stand at the feet of Lincoln or reflect on the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Our commitment to fair treatment under law is literally etched in stone above the entrance to the U.S. Supreme Court. But liberty is not the only ideal threatened by our country's prison system. It turns out justice in the U.S. is not everything it's made out to be. At the top of a high-rise building, we learned how people who are poor have more encounters with law enforcement simply due to the methods police use to patrol different neighborhoods.
Every contact I've ever had with the police has always been this very nice, kind, thank you, officer, appreciate your help, very polite, never ever ask me to rifle through my car or if they could pat me down or any of those things. But the vast majority of my clients and the vast majority of people that I've interacted with in very poor areas of our society say that that's just not an uncommon event in their life, to be a passenger in a car that got stopped and get out and pulled out and searched. That it's not uncommon for a police officer to ask somebody to come over and talk to them, but in the process, pat them down. There's a different viewpoint. Now the police, in their defense, they are working in an area that has very high crime statistics, so they are being more careful about what they're doing. They want to make sure that they're safe, and I get that, and I completely respect that. But again, which one came first? If the police drove through your middle class, upper middle class neighborhood and started doing these same policies, there would be a hue and outcry that would astonish you. There is a hue and outcry in the poor neighborhoods. They simply have no voice that gets any further than the poor neighborhood.
Understandably, the tougher law enforcement practices used in poor neighborhoods, combined with the ever-increasing severity of penalties, create serious mistrust between police and communities. In the United States, it's impossible to talk about socioeconomic class without also talking about race. So we went to see a sociology professor to find out how our criminal justice system treats racial minorities.
The drug war has been particularly problematic in the way in which it has magnified racial disproportionalities. And the relative level of drug use is not significantly unequal. The drug war could have been fought in middle-class suburbia, but the drug war was not fought in middle-class suburbia. The drug war was constructed and enacted in a way that impacted neighborhoods of African American and working class and poverty concentration. And as a result, you've got this churning system in which increasing numbers of African American young people can be processed through the system because of the neighborhood targeted focus. If you move from initial street contact to formal arrest to adjudication and charge to how the individual is sentenced, at every level of the process, the level of race and ethnic disproportionality increases. And so you get an imprisonment rate that is severely disproportionate as a product of both race and class.
Today in our country, whites make up 63% of our population, but just 33% of our prisoners, which is about half what you would expect. Blacks make up only 14% of our population, but 37% of our prisoners, 2.5 times what they would if the demographics of prisoners matched the demographics of the rest of the country. These numbers represent more than just the lives of the prisoners. It turns out being tough on crime is also tough on communities. In interview after interview, one thing everyone seemed to agree on is that our criminal justice system does not always make communities safer. In fact, if you live in a poor or black neighborhood, it may make things worse.
In Ohio, 5,000 people a year come to our prisons that have never been, ever, currently or in their entire life, arrested, indicted, or convicted of any violence.
About 10,000, maybe even more, people who are in prison today in Ohio are low-level, low-risk offenders. That means they committed a very low-level crime, may have possessed some drug, and when you look at their risk factors, are they likely to be a criminal doing this again? Are they likely to harm somebody? They come out on low-risk factors, that they're very unlikely to commit more serious crimes. The problem is, the moment you put them in prison, those 10,000 people who qualify in those two categories, they are much more likely to become higher risk individuals by being in prison. We are safer as a society if we treat them in our communities. We are safer as a society if we give them drug treatment and don't incarcerate them.
When you remove individuals in the prime of their early formative stages of adulthood and establishing relationships to the world of work and to family regularity and the like, you have lesser educational participation outcomes from very early on. You have lesser economic outcomes because their relationship to the world of work has been hurt. You have reduced family stability outcomes because their ability to establish and sustain viable relationships, marital or otherwise, has been severely hurt. The communities that are left behind are more unstable.
With communities being hurt by the very policies that are supposed to keep them safe, and with so many disparities based on class and race, it seems the U.S. legal system only protects liberty and justice for some. The injustices of these practices are well documented in statistics. The problem with statistics is we forget the real people they represent. There is a certain ambivalence many of us feel about the glaring inequities. People who believe they won't personally be affected by racial profiling or neighborhood crackdowns ignore the statistics and go about their day. In other words, it's hard to get middle-class white people to care about poor black criminals. But it's a mistake to believe an unjust system should be left alone just because it benefits you. The fact that the scales tip in your favor does not mean you should pretend they are balanced. The damage caused by mass incarceration extends beyond individuals to families and communities. It deepens the cycle of poverty in concentrated areas and perpetuates racial inequality. The tensions caused by these disparities tear at the fabric of our society, widening divisions across class and race. In the end, everyone is affected by the inequities. By definition, a society's systems must be either fair or unfair, equal or unequal, just or unjust. And I wonder how long it will be before more people see that injustice for some is injustice for all.